So I want to go on now to our next speaker, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Cylvia Hayes, who I met many years ago, probably 2011. And this, I have to say this because it was one of the most neat experiences that I have had. I got a phone call one day, and the person on the other line said, "Hi, you don't know me, but I'm Cylvia Hayes, and I'm the First Lady of Oregon. And I just read your book, What's the Economy For Anyway? And I like it, and I wanted to tell you that." And anybody know, if you're a writer, you really appreciate that, and you especially appreciate when the First Lady of a state calls you up and tells you that. So I always make that a point. If you like someone's book, let them know. It is the most wonderful feeling for the author to hear that. But Cylvia has done many, many things in her life. She is a graduate, master's graduate of Evergreen State College here in Washington, where I had the pleasure of teaching some years ago. And she has worked in the alternative energy field as a consultant, runs a company called 3E Strategies, Energy Equity and Economy. See, I'm always trying to get rid of that economy. The author of What's the Economy For, as Sylvia points out, is trying to get rid of that. And Cylvia has been a great activist in promoting the concept of the genuine progress indicator. She worked with Governor O'Malley, Martin O'Malley, who you may have remembered from the early Democratic debates. Cylvia and Governor O'Malley were instrumental in promoting the concept of a genuine progress indicator as an alternative to GDP and the way that we measure things. But I don't want to take up any more of Cylvia's time. I know she's got a great story to tell you, and I am delighted to introduce Cylvia Hayes.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. And again, I really want to just say how much I appreciate John DeGraff and all of his work that he's doing on his birthday, no less, to bring us all together. I think it's really important. In the afternoon panel session that I'm on, I'm going to talk more about my professional work that he mentioned and going beyond the limitless growth economy and beyond GDP. But this morning with you all, I'm going to talk about a very new subject and a very personal subject. And it's how, as the title of my talk explains, how a fall from grace led me to a pretty graceful transition in how I relate to time. And I'm just working my way through how to talk about all of these experiences, and I hope that you guys will find it of some value. October 7th, 2014, I was having a great day. John, my fiance, third-term governor of Oregon, whom you heard from last night, was running for re-election for an unprecedented fourth term. We were in that uber-busy campaign mode. I was feeling good about speeches I'd given that morning on the First Lady work that I'd been doing on poverty reduction. I was liking campaigning. He and I were super excited about what all we had planned for the next 4 years. And I was coming back from those speeches. I was sitting in the back of one of the sinister black security vehicles that we got hauled around in. And that was really at odds with my own personal Prius, but it was what it was. And I get a phone call on my cell phone. And on the other end of the call is John's campaign manager. And she asks, "Cylvia, what are these calls we're getting from this reporter who's asking about you having been married 3 times, when I had publicly stated that I'd been married twice?" Boom. That was one of those moments where your breath just stops. I knew right then my life was blowing up. I had indeed, 17 years prior to that, been involved in a green card marriage for money. And this reporter was on to it. Those misdeeds from my past were put forward very strategically in a very agenda-driven, politically driven media character assassination designed to take us down. And I had to face the fact that my being naive enough to get into such a high-profile position without knowing that that would come to the fore had not only blown my life up, it had also blown up the life of the person I love most in this world. And I will tell you that the media, I'm sure some of you had to have heard this, because for quite some time I was the newspapers in our neck of the woods. I mean, the media feeding frenzy was unlike anything that Pacific Northwest politics have ever experienced thus far. I could not believe it was happening. More than any time in my life, I had that feeling of, surely this is a nightmare, and I am going to wake up from it. And I didn't wake up from it, and I had to deal with it in a public setting, and so did John. We're both still healing and dealing with it, and I'll tell you that other than at my church, this is the first time I've spoken about it publicly. There are a number of key experiences that have come out of this. One of them, one of the insights was, I was shocked to find out what media could get away with. I was shocked to find out how broken our current sensationalist media culture is. This has totally changed how and where I get my news. I was also really disturbed. I've always believed we need to evolve as a country past a two-party political system personally, but I was shocked to see how truly dysfunctional that two-party system was in this case. And also just the tremendous resistance to really challenging status quo systems, which I think is what brings so many of us together here. I touch on all of those things in my book about this, which hopefully will be out early next year. And I have to say, to John's point, I've always believed I would be an author, not just a writer. I've always believed I would have a book. I never dreamed my first book would be about the experience of being publicly shamed. But it is what it is. That's what I've been working on. But the part of all of this that I'm really most interested in sharing is just the personal journey that I've been on and how this has turned out to be one of the most important growth periods of my entire life. I can move our slide here. So it's really difficult to describe what it's like to become clickbait. I had never heard that term prior to being clickbait. And the intensity of it, the inability to control it is really, really something that is surreal to go through. Reporters were staked outside the governor's residence in Salem, where I spent part of my time. Even my own little 960 square foot home in Bend, they were there as well. I got anonymous death and rape threats. I was terrified to even go out into public. And I will tell you that this experience took me to some pretty dark places. It was a humiliation unlike anything I had ever believed I would ever experience. I had the terror of feeling my identity being torn down and replaced with something else, and I didn't know if my career was going to survive this in any way at all. I had the painful realization, I'm going to get very honest with you, one of the big growth pieces in all of this is I believed I was a pretty self-aware person, and I think I was a pretty self-aware person, but I could not believe how much more ego-driven I had been in my work until all of this happened. And that comes back around to the topic of how we spend our time in a moment. And there was just a crushing, unbelievable sense of loss and abandonment, and I'll tell you one thing for sure, as someone who's been relatively popular in my life and lucky to say that, I couldn't believe how painful the abandonment and isolation became. It was really a learning experience for me. And again, one of the worst was facing what my mistakes and naivety had cost John. That was really, really, really dark and hard stuff. And so in the pit of this sensationalized public shaming, I, for the first time, really got to face my own sense of shame. Now, most people, thank God, don't go through something like this on such a public setting, although that's becoming more common in our culture, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But I've learned a lot. I think I'm actually becoming something of a shame expert, which I didn't ask for, didn't see coming. But I think it really is, from all the research that I have been doing and the work on my book, it's a pretty universal feeling in some ways. I think most of us have those moments where we question, oh my gosh, What's wrong with me that I can't make more money? Or, man, I'm glad no one can see me raiding the fridge right now at 1 a.m. in the morning. Or, is my child in trouble because of what I did as a parent? And this emotion of shame is one of the very most difficult emotions for us to deal with. Guilt is the feeling that we've done something wrong, or wrong or bad, and shame is the feeling that we are bad. And it's been very interesting to face that. And we exist now more than ever before. I mean, the mob mentality has always been a part of our species, sadly, but we exist now in a culture of shame. And it's largely driven by the culmination of this sensationalist 24/7 clickbait-oriented media business model and the anonymous social media connection. And we touched on that a little bit last night. I can tell you, I have yet to this day, it'll be 2 years in October, I was terrified to go into public. I have never had a single person say an unkind thing to my face. It's always come in anonymously. And this is what we're seeing a lot, I think, in the explosion of bullying with young people as well. It's a tremendously challenging dynamic. Beyond the pain that I'd caused John, and coming back around to the subject of time and work and life-work balance, the biggest dagger in my heart, the biggest hit to my self-worth was the loss of my work. And because of the way this came down and the allegations of corruption that the media ran with, my attorneys advised that I should not make contact with any of my colleagues or my clients or my professional networks that I'd been working with, because the case could be made that they would be called as witnesses at some point going forward. And this hit me, I swear, I've journaled about those times using the term that it felt like I had a train car sitting on my chest. It was hard to take a full, deep breath with the work taken away. When I finally started to get my head around how long it was going to take to move through this and to get my work back on track, I had a fairly long stretch of what I now call, with some affection, my dirty bathrobe days. These are the days where I was just so flattened by this that I would roll out of bed after a really crappy sleep anyway, slither into my already stained bathrobe, slink onto the couch, and spend all day long binge watching television. Way too much Game of Thrones and Heartland and predictable Lifetime movies. It was anesthesia for me. And it was right after 2 days of that that I had my first big point of surrender. And I got up that morning still just feeling baked, wiped out from all of this, but I just couldn't hit the couch again. And so it was really early and it was really cold. I was back in my little bend household, and we were having single-digit temperatures. And I slinked out into my little hot tub. I have a tiny little hot tub on my deck, and I was sitting there, and I was so stressed that I felt like I was on some sort of drug. And I just had something cracked through me in that moment. I have been out there on cold mornings with the steam rolling off the hot water and the sunshine for hundreds of times. I'd never seen it before. I'd never actually been present enough to be. I have now coined a term. We see in 3D, I've coined a term called PD. It's presence dimension. It was like seeing a whole different facet of everything I looked at. And I realized in that moment that I couldn't control any of this. I couldn't control what the media was going to do. I couldn't control what it meant for my career. I couldn't control what it meant for my relationships. I could only control how I handled it. I could only control my inner journey. And in that instant, time vanished. It is the most incredibly present and peaceful, believe it or not, experience I had ever had to date. And it hugely surprised me, because being very honest with you again, I have had a lifelong journey to feel like I'm enough, or I'm good enough, or I have value just as who I am. My work has been the way that I have felt like I was making a contribution, felt like I was doing enough with my life. That's where I got the validation from others that I had value. And when I hit that moment and I actually released the need for that work, I went to a whole new level in feeling enough that I've been working with ever since, and I'm actually really excited about it. And to our topic, I think part of the reason that I have been such a workaholic is because I have based so much of my own sense of worth on my outward journey. To the point where I've always believed, I've always had a spiritual practice. I've been a lifelong meditator. I've been, committed to spiritual practices, but those were always the first thing that would fall off my full plate when things got going busy. I very much had my identity tied to the feeling of importance from all the busyness in my life. So I would just urge, I will now tell you that I've gotten to the point in all of this where I look at this 2 years as difficult, yes, but also as a gift wrapped in barbed wire. I've blogged about that, actually, and I'm super excited about the quality of work that I'm now doing because I have reprioritized my time. My meditation, my spiritual practices, those are no longer the first thing to fall off my plate, and I'll come back to that in just a second. So I would just like to say for many of you here who are focused on a healthy work-life balance, who are focused on not just falling into the trap of the status quo, it's really been very useful to me to be very honest with myself about why do I keep doing it? Why do I keep driving too hard or driving in a direction I don't want to when I know I'd prefer to do something else? Also, for those of us who really want to use our lives to make the world a better place, and I think that that's actually most people, and particularly most of us here in this room, I think there's a very important link here. I think that how we handle our inner environment is inextricably linked to what we produce in our outer environment, to what we produce in our work and in changing the systems that we're all trying to change. I mean, after all, Einstein said, you can't use the same level of thinking that created the problem in the first place. And I think that this convergence of how we are, not just who we are, but how we are and what we do, is one of the single most important reasons to be having this National Take Back Your Time discussion. A lot of people are going to be talking about the direct connection between the hours we work, how we work, our stress and health and environmental benefits and all of that. I'm not going to talk on that directly. I will say, and again, I'll talk more about it this afternoon in the panel, I think that every major problem we face today, climate change, loss of species, poverty, even the spread of mass terrorism, is the result of a faulty global economic model. I think that there are several dangerous, life-threatening flaws in the current manifestation of capitalism. One of them is the belief that we can and must continuously increase natural resource consumption on a planet of finite natural resources. And two is measuring profits without factoring in all the externalized costs such as pollution, health impacts, etc. But the one piece of this flawed system that I think is most directly relevant to this conference is that our current economy is part of and inextricably linked to a national culture that equates our personal value with busyness and productivity with the hours that we put into our work. We're often judged, ridiculed, viewed as less than when we pull back from that particular norm. There's this piece I wanted to show next. This is a really wonderful article, I have found it to be so, from a woman named Janie Stevenson. And she talks about how, and I love that we were just talking about citizen activists. How many in the room would consider yourself an activist? I think most of us. She talks about this particular dynamic specifically as it relates to activists. And she notes that there's a unique challenge for us, or for anyone who's really paying enough attention, I think, to be in this room, that we are trying to change the systems while immersed in those very systems, immersed in that very way of thinking that's creating the problem that we're trying to address in the first place. I mean, Einstein would argue that we're in a really difficult spot with that. So in this piece, she makes the point that there's currently a lot of activism going on trying to help us make the shift to a healthier economy, to go post-capitalism, or at least an evolved form of capitalism, but that we're mostly doing it in ways that fall into the traps of the very status quo system that we are trying to change. And one of those traps is the need for ceaseless productivity. Capitalism, I'm sure you're familiar, teaches that if you're not growing, improving, if you're not getting bigger, we're failing. And I can tell you that for myself, in my work as a activist, in the systems I'm trying to change, I have been so wildly guilty of that, and have only seen that fairly clearly in the last couple of years. We fight and fight, I think for me, maybe most of us, because we have this sense of urgency around the issues that we're trying to address. We keep going even when we're exhausted. And though it's hard to admit, the way we're going about making change is often perpetuating the very systems that we're trying to change. I think we have a skewed definition of productivity. I think this is another one of those really important questions that we need to ask, like, what's the economy for anyway? Which is a brilliant question. We'll go and go and go and drive and drive and drive until something, illness, tragedy, public shaming, forces us to stop. And in those broken moments, often we even veer further from the changes that we're trying to make, because in the exhaustion or the self-medication or whatever, we're consuming more, we're watching more TV, we're actually not behaving in the healthful way that we know would help us to perpetuate positive change. Eventually, we get ourselves a little righted, we get back out there into the fight, we get hammered by the same systems, by the same patterns, we get right back in the same level of thinking that we were in the first place. I've done it in my own life. I've shared some of this in my own blog. I was trying to do very good work in that First Lady role, but in part the way I was going about it is what helped to lead to the blow-up that has happened in my career. That's a hugely painful lesson, but also a hugely, hugely valuable one. I think that when the mess exploded in my life, it was not until I really radically shifted my thinking and my way of being. I worked hard to drop the anger. I worked hard to really become less reactionary. And I began to lean into the learning opportunity. I began to view it as a spiritual intervention. And that's when I started moving from breaking down to breaking open. And I'm super excited to see what happens with my work, let alone my life, going forward from that perspective. I think in these times we look around and, boy, all that's going on, it really certainly feels like there are significant changes going on. It is a season of change in our planet and in our species, it feels to me. You see it on collective level, you see it at our national level, for the first time perhaps in our species at a global level, and a lot of us personally are going through big changes at a personal individual level. In her wonderful article, Stevenson notes that there is an alternative. Let me take a step back. I lost my train of thought there. So when these changes are going on at the scale that they're going on, especially for advocates, it's easy to feel like we're on the pendulum between being powerless and effective, or powerless and productive, and that pendulum itself is exhausting. And what she makes a point in this article that I love, she says there's a middle ground there, and it's a term she calls holding. And holding involves finding stillness, accepting a time without pushing ourselves for a while, even when we're feeling so urgent about the issues we're working on, and prioritizing our inner journey. And in a world where we have such a skewed definition of productivity, that kind of quality inner time, I think, is true resistance. I have navigated a lot of reinventions in my life, but this public one, challenged me for the very first time to really, truly slow down. I could not just keep working. This was the first chance that I actually got to focus on being a human being instead of a human doing. I've been a human doing most of my life. Prior to this, as I mentioned, my meditation, my spiritual practices were the first things I'd let go when I got overly busy. I don't do that anymore, and it's transformative. I now know that that is, in a different definition of productivity, that is some of the most productive time that I spend. Looking back, looking around at all the change that's going on in our world, I find hope in the life cycle of a lowly worm. A caterpillar, in making its amazing evolution into a butterfly, it holes up for a time. It retreats from its, wormy, leaf-eating busyness. It takes a little break. And what's interesting, it turns out that this still time winds up being some of its most productive. As it's resting, it starts to create these things called, I love this term, imaginal cells. And imaginal cells, they are so foreign to the little worm body, the caterpillar status quo, if you will, that its immune system attacks them. And that furthers the degeneration of the caterpillar body. But the imaginal cells keep coming, they keep linking up and getting stronger, and pretty soon, at the point of greatest disintegration of the caterpillar form, enough of these imaginal cells have banded together that they have kind of this collective moment where they realize, oh my gosh, we're a butterfly. That gives me great hope. And I look around and I think maybe I'm looking at an auditorium filled with imaginal cells in our status quo economic system. I mean, yeah, we're definitely, we open ourselves up for attack by the status quo immune system, but we keep coming and we keep coming together. And if we keep doing that, I believe there will be a point where we collectively realize, oh my gosh, we're a whole new creature. We're a whole new system. And I would just close by saying, I think it's sometimes when in our own lives or in our society, when we need those moments where it feels like things are really falling apart for things to really fall into place. So thank you. I'm happy to. Sure. It's a great question. It's a fundamental question, and I will tell you, it was honestly one of the greatest frustrations I had in the First Lady role, even when we were doing great work before all of this happened, because I had already been on the path that inner quality time and some reflective time. I've had a lot of training in collaborative leadership and kind of the link between our spiritual or inner way of being and the work that we manifest in the world. I've worked with Presencing Institute and some others who've done quite a bit of that, and it was so unbelievably difficult to get anyone within certainly the governmental realm to go there, because it's an adrenaline addicted type of personality for the most part that wants to be at that level of government. So that was very challenging. I'm more hopeful in the work that I'm doing, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the panel. I don't want to get us off time, but I've been doing some really phenomenal work with in the business sector, but to nutshell this, I believe there's a new evolution happening in sustainable business that's moving us from a triple bottom line to a quadruple bottom line. And these are businesses that start by asking a different question, which is not how can I mitigate the damage, the environmental or social damage that my manufacturing process or product or whatever does, but how can I actually create or work with a business that exists to serve the common good. And most of those companies have a much better recognition that we've got to, that their systems themselves have to honor this new way of handling time, this new way of allowing for creativity and allowing for self-care. So I'm finding some real hope there. And I think, you know, the other thing that this has been my advocate bandwagon for a long time, all of us who recognize this, even when we find ourselves caught in the system, or, you know, we drive our vehicles here, all of those things, just to keep acknowledging that we're caught in a system we're trying to change, and not talking about it. Not being afraid that we're going to be called hypocrites because we do exist within that system. The whole point, I try to look at my fossil fuel consumption, by the way. I quit water skiing years ago because it was, in my opinion, I hope I don't offend anyone, an unnecessary use of fossil fuel, if you will. You know, so it's how do I not hide the fact that I'm caught in a system, but become aware of it and help others become aware of it as well, so that we can make different decisions.
Thank you.